World War II in the Pacific. Autumn, 1944. America is winning. Then, the desperate Japanese spring an unbelievable surprise. A lone Japanese plane speeds toward the U.S. escort carrier Senlo off the Philippine Islands. The Japanese pilot dives, then coolly, deliberately aims his bomb-laden Zero fighter at the Senlo and crashes into the ship. A few hours later, she goes under. The first American ship sunk by the Kamikaze, the Death Squadron. Kamikaze, not just one or two, but thousands. Japanese suicide pilots who will fall from the sky like cherry blossoms. Blossoms of death. In futile frenzy, they will sink and damage scores of American ships. They will kill and wound thousands of Americans. These kamikaze will go willingly with pride to eternal glory, leaving us to wonder, who were these children of death? Why did they fly their missions to oblivion? Kamikaze, mission of death. Kamikaze. In Japanese, the word means divine wind. 7 centuries ago, when the legendary conqueror Kublai Khan massed Mongol troops to invade Japan's home island, a raging typhoon decimated and turned back the invasion fleet. The divine wind, the kamikaze. In 1944, the invasion fleet was American, and Japan again needed a miracle. A divine wind. The top Japanese military commanders had to face the fact that Japan was losing the war. What could they do to stem the tide of defeat? They knew that they could call on the Japanese tradition of self-sacrifice. So they authorized suicide by their finest young men as a weapon. In the field, the plan is outlined on October 19, 1944, by Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, a fanatic militarist. On the Philippine island of Luzon, Admiral Onishi tells his men what thousands would hear in the months ahead, Army flyers as well as Navy.
We are critically short of planes and pilots. Conventional air attacks cannot save us. Each of our planes must knock out an American aircraft carrier. This is possible only by crash diving. You are already gods without earthly desires. But the one thing you want to know is that your own crash dive is not in vain. I shall watch your efforts to the end and report your deeds to the throne.
The plan was brutally simple. Instead of releasing the bombs at a distance, the pilot would guarantee accuracy by delivering his bomb all the way to the target himself. This way, one pilot in one plane could cripple an entire American carrier, a floating combat airfield with its scores of airplanes and thousands of fighting men. It was Japan's only hope. Onishi's passionate words stirred an ancient heritage in these young men. They accepted his mandate to die willingly for their emperor in stoic silence. They toasted their decision in sake wine. Their reward would be glory among Japan's hero warriors. Premeditated suicide. Pilots had crash-dived stricken planes into enemy ships before as an act of final defiance, but those were individual actions. this was very different. Now mass premeditated suicide became official military policy. The Kamikaze Special Attack Force was born. The Kamikaze volunteers believed that only their sacrificial death could change a terrible fate. They were told over and over that if the Americans conquered Japan, their women would be raped, their emperor humiliated, their nation destroyed. Banzai! They shouted the patriotic slogan that means Japan will live for 10,000 years. Banzai! The samurai code of honor that gave those pilots strength went back 2,600 years. The ethic of Japan's samurai warriors stressed unquestioning loyalty and obedience to the emperor. The Kamikaze saw themselves as the new samurai. In these desperate hours, the Kamikaze pilots relied on their tradition of death for honor. Or if they secretly feared death, they would not admit such heresy. Before the pilots went to die, many wrote last letters home to their loved ones. Among the rare surviving letters are some actually hopeful, poetic epitaphs. Tomohiro Saito, a university graduate, wrote,
"I will end my story at 21 years. I give these words to my father. Ride the skies. I am the shield of the emperor as I ride."
Saito sacrificed himself off Okinawa May 4th, 1945. Masahisa Uemura wrote to his 4-year-old daughter, Motoko,
"Dear Moko, grow up to be a healthy and big girl. Daddy will make an attack on the enemies. When you grow up, you will understand."
Uemura crashed and died off the Philippines in October 1944. Takeo Kobayashi, who was a Chuo University graduate, proudly painted a Japanese flag with his own blood and left it as a parting souvenir. Kobayashi crash-dived in the Philippine campaign. Masafumi Yasuhara had received a toy doll, a gift, from a little girl. On the eve of his mission, he sent back the doll with this note.
"Dear doll, thank you for coming a long way and comforting me. When nobody is here, go back to your mother. You will be taken care of forever. Sayonara."
Yasuhara crashed his suicide plane off Okinawa in March 1945. Morimasa Yunakawa prepared to die, but lived to tell the tale. As he was about to take off, a squadron of American fighters swooped down and destroyed his unit on the ground.
もう古いことで忘れてしまいましたね。
Yunakawa still remembers clearly how much he was let down at the time.
I was terribly sad, and not only me. One of my crew cried out, "Damn it!" He was very disappointed.
More than 3 decades later, the bizarre memory lingers. He missed his rendezvous with death. Such was the power of the kamikaze emotion. The suicide pilots experienced a kind of hypnotic trance. As their hour to die came closer, their spirits soared. They felt a sense of ecstasy. The kamikaze performed a ritual before his final flight. First, his letter home. Next, a farewell to close comrades and a toast in sake wine. And then, an inspirational farewell from his commanding officer. The pilot was reminded that one of the best ways to ensure success, the destruction of an American ship, was to crash dive at a steep angle. The science of kamikaze suicide had been carefully worked out by experts. The main thing was to make sure that death was not in vain. The kamikazes were told over and over again,
don't be in too much of a hurry to die. If you cannot find your target, turn back. Choose the death which brings about a maximum result.
The last ritual act was for the kamikaze pilot to tie a cloth decorated with a samurai symbol around his forehead, with slogans like Gokoku, defend Japan, or Go-Chin, sink ships. Then came the signal to take off and find glory. Ideally, the kamikazes flew in groups of 3, with fighter escorts to fend off the American fighter planes that rose from the carriers to meet them. The kamikaze had to fly through a wall of Grumman Hellcats and a curtain of lead from anti-aircraft guns on the American ships below. The kamikazes dived and became as one with their death machines. In the final moment, even momentary flinching could mean a miss, so the pilots were ordered to die with their eyes wide open, looking death squarely in the face. In January 1945, after 4 months of kamikaze pressure, American forces landed on the main Philippine island of Luzon and drove to the capital city, Manila. But the kamikazes had made the cost of victory very high. More than 100 American ships sunk or damaged. 2 escort carriers sent to the bottom. 9 larger carriers and 5 battleships damaged. Some 4,000 Americans killed or wounded by the concentrated suicide attacks. Japan had lost more than 400 kamikaze pilots and planes and well over 100 escorts. The toll they took gave hope to Japan's most fanatic military leaders. Hope that they might actually halt the American onslaught and save what was left of Japan's domain. So more calls went out for more kamikazes, even though many knew that it was a lost cause, even though Japan's best pilots were already dead. The Japanese air forces were reduced to flying patchwork planes. The kamikaze had begun as a volunteer service. Now, Japanese pilots were ordered to die by their officers because there were no longer enough volunteers. In the spring of 1945, everyone who could fly or could learn to waited for the fateful order to join the kamikaze ranks. While newspaper and radio reports told Americans back home that the kamikazes were a breed apart, drug-crazed fanatics who flew like madmen, the truth was far different. The kamikaze pilots were hardly more than adolescents, taught to follow a strict code of discipline that demanded their death. Many of them had been ordered up to battle from their college classrooms, like Nobuya Kinase.
In my unit, Lieutenant Shiro and Ito were from Meiji University. Shiro was a ski jumping champion. Lieutenant Okabe was on the Japanese wrestling team at Waseda University.
Lieutenant Kinase attended Keio University and lived to tell about his friends. He still sheds tears for his departed comrades.
I survived, but all the other 8 members were killed. I was transferred to make up another unit. There is only one survivor. That is me. It is very sorrowful to be the only survivor.
Before going off to die, Kinase's friends wrote their personal slogans on a cloth he has treasured ever since. Kuda Takashi's last words were joyful laughter. And Lieutenant Tokioka's farewell, death is life. And so it was that this second wave of suicide pilots were caught up in the kamikaze fervor. Even these young pilots who were literally ordered to sacrifice themselves Their initial fear soon vanished, and they accepted their fate with pride, as expressed in this epitaph.
What is my duty today? It is to fight. What is my duty tomorrow? It is to win. What is the daily duty? It is to die.
There was no time to adequately train the new pilots. The planes they flew were often defective, and the Americans had learned how to better defend against them. By the spring, more and more kamikazes were shot out of the sky. But they came like a plague of moths, guided by the light of eternal glory. They came, they died, and others followed. Japanese newsreels celebrated the kamikaze ideal. The idea of deliberate death as the way to victory was no longer confined to flyers. In April 1945, as American troops stormed ashore at Okinawa, the doorstep of Japan, the Japanese surface navy took up the kamikaze concept. The best remnants of the Japanese fleet were chosen for a suicide mission. 10 ships, including the giant battleship Yamato, sailed for Okinawa. The fleet was commanded to deliberately beach itself, to run aground, to confront the massive American forces as they attacked Okinawa, and to fire every gun until every shell was spent and the last Japanese sailor was dead. But 300 carrier-based American planes rose to attack the suicide flotilla before it could reach its target. In a matter of hours, the Japanese vessels were sent to watery graves. Only 4 destroyers got away. Japan's navy had lost what was left of its might, along with more than 2,500 lives.
Banzai!
But in the face of defeat, the kamikaze frenzy increased. There were one-man, one-way submarines. On land, Japanese soldiers threw their bodies against American steel in futile banzai charges as they had throughout the war. And most desperate of all, there was the diabolical Baka bomb, a rocket-boosted aerial torpedo released by a mother aircraft and actually piloted all the way to the target. The Japanese called the weapon Oka, which means cherry blossom. The Americans called them Baka, the Japanese word for crazy. The kamikaze fury reached its peak in April and May of 1945 off Okinawa. It was Japan's last-ditch effort to stem an American invasion of Japan itself. The American people were told the news that the kamikazes were an ineffective weapon. The facts were otherwise. Off Okinawa, the carriers Bunker Hill, Intrepid, Hancock, and Enterprise were hit. On April 6 alone, nearly 200 kamikazes attacked. They sank 2 American destroyers and damaged 10 more among the vessels hit that day. And on the 16th, 126 kamikazes and 6 Baka bombs sank the destroyer Pringle and damaged a major carrier and 5 other ships. From beginning to end of the kamikazes, the U.S. Navy took the worst casualties in its history. 34 ships were sunk. Nearly 300 ships suffered severe damage. Many were made useless. More than 10,000 American sailors were killed or wounded. Many of the dead were buried at sea. It had cost Japan more than 2,500 pilots and planes, but they could not change the face of the war. For all the destruction wrought by the kamikazes, the Americans would not be stopped. American bombers blasted Japan's major cities around the clock. American Marines and soldiers were rooting Japanese soldiers out of the caves of Okinawa. The Allied High Command demanded that the Japanese surrender unconditionally. The Japanese leaders resisted. They believed continued resistance might buy them better terms than unconditional surrender. Kamikaze frenzy spread throughout the military and even to the civilian population. Civilians as well as soldiers chose death over surrender. Even though Tokyo had been flattened by bombing, the American command was faced with the grim reality that an American invasion could cost the lives of 1 million American men. It seemed the war could go on forever against a suicidal enemy. This conclusion was presented to President Harry Truman as he pondered the agonizing decision of whether to unleash the horror of the atomic bomb. August 1945, Hiroshima, 70,000 killed. 3 days later, Nagasaki, 40,000 dead. Even after that, the father of the Kamikaze, Admiral Onishi, still called for more Kamikaze pilots. Onishi would give up his fight only after Emperor Hirohito personally announced Japan would surrender. The Japanese public had never before heard the voice of Emperor Hirohito. They heard it for the first time on the radio. It was their God condescending to talk to them. The Japanese had surrendered. Admiral Onishi knew what he had to do. In his second-floor study, the admiral unsheathed a sword and disemboweled himself. Harakiri, ritual suicide. The traditional time-honored way for a Japanese to assume full responsibility for his acts, to relieve his followers of the burden of punishment. This last Kamikaze lingered 12 hours, refusing help, welcoming his pain and suffering as atonement for failure. In a final note, he wrote,
I wish to express my deep appreciation to the souls of the brave special attackers. And I apologize to the souls of these dead flyers and their bereaved families. I wish the young people of Japan to find the moral in my death. With all the fervor of spirit of the special attackers, strive for the welfare of Japan and for peace throughout the world.
Admiral Onishi died at 6 p.m. August 15, 1945. After the war, many Japanese turned against the military extremists responsible for the war and Japan's defeat. At the same time, they denounced the kamikaze ethic as barbarous. But to this day, the kamikaze pilots are looked on as heroes. Young men who died willingly for Japan. Kamikaze, young men, boys, with a samurai symbol tied around their heads. They drank a farewell toast, looked death squarely in the face, unflinching, and died for an empire that was already lost. Kamikaze, mission of death.